ModPo has come to Seattle, Washington, and I'm standing here in the back of the famous fish market in front of the Puget Sound. And that location's not really relevant to the video we're about to make with David Colon over back in our hotel. David Colon and I are going to be talking about Rosa Alcalá and a book that she wrote called Undocumentaries. I'm really excited about that. It's not really a Seattle-ish thing, but it's an opportunity to meet up with David, and I'm looking forward to it. Well, I'm here with David Colon. David, how are you?
All right, Al, how are you?
Good, great. I'm so happy that you're here. Thanks for taking the time. Here is Seattle. Mm-hmm. Neither of us is a Seattle person.
No, not at all.
But it's Seattle. Look, there's water and barges and I don't know. There's something on the other side. More houses. Mm-hmm. A Ferris wheel of some kind.
And all sorts of organic and craft cocktails out there.
There's craft cocktails. And then beyond the craft cocktails, raw fish. So
exactly.
But, you know, it's. I shouldn't even have mentioned Seattle because Rosa Alcalá is Patterson, New Jersey based. Or not based, anyway, it's Texas now. But,
yeah.
So we're really not talking about a Seattle, Northwest sensibility.
No.
So there's a book called Undocumentaries. Mm-hmm. And I've known about it, but our correspondence has led me to it. And I really, really love it. And we're going to talk about, rather than trying to talk about the whole poem, we're going to talk about two pieces from it.
Sure.
And these are Land Art in the Silk City and a prose poem called Adventures in Food Processing, Job Number 2.
Yeah.
So I think maybe I'll ask you to read the first one, Land Art, sure. And then I'll read Adventures in Food Processing, and then we'll talk about it.
Okay. This poem's called Land Art in the Silk City. They filmed the paint factory from the second story of our house, all those cameras looking out from us. We were the evening news, long as buildings were ablaze, or how the boy up the street dabbled in mesmerism, staring at a telephone wire and calling a name, rubbing letter against letter until a spark took flight down the line. She picked up always to a swirling sound, and how no one knows what's brewing next door until one barrel after another shoots 50 feet into the air and stars the night. What becomes visible in calamity quickly burns to nothing. He thought it best to send away for another guide. What art would power him to turn the river back to silk and make the world watch it burn?
Adventures in Food Processing, Job Number 2. Secretary to the sanitary piping impresario, his rubber leg, my nude hose, selling butt weld fittings, feminine parts for the ubiquitous screw. Even then, the only lady in the room, and with the dirtiest joke. Dangerously close to the electric heater, we could be dorm room lovers whispering of revolutions in vacuum-packed foods. I look out the window to where the woods meet the road and think not everyone knows how peas get in a can, that the world needs me to sort out their messes from their mayonnaise, the lamentable suckback of such ignorance. Wow, both of those are great. I want to start with Land Art in the Silk City, but first, a little more Patterson context. So Patterson, we know, is the home of William Carlos Williams. Mm-hmm. The Passaic River runs through it. It's famous, and Allen Ginsberg as well. Mm-hmm. My left literary history, my left political history, reminds me that it was the site in circa 1917 or so of some great, almost integral strikes, not just industry-specific strikes, but sort of general strikes.
Yeah.
And was there a silk factory, silk manufacturing? I think so.
Yeah, there were actually several, and the name Silk City is a nickname. I think it was actually the end of the 18th century, from the end of the 18th century up to the early 20th century, that area was being industrialized around the Passaic River to harness the water power to be able to fuel factories, and particularly silk became a major product from there. So it got that name, and I think up until around the First World War, it was really a center of that production.
So Patterson's contribution to the arts peaked, I want to say, in the 20s and 30s when the literary left had been, was really connected to the political union-affiliated left. So Rosa Alcalá is in a tradition less of Williams, although Williams must be in the background because he really made an aesthetic that wanted to include industrial facts and people.
And also, when we think about Patterson, Carlos Williams as Patterson, it has a documentary aspect. Yes, I mean that's really what in some ways. I mean, people think of it as collage or bricolage, or sort of using lots of found source texts to put together a narrative of this localized place that somehow is kind of metonymic of an American experience, maybe. But the impetus is kind of similar, of documenting everyday life, workers, and I really do think that for Williams as well as for Alcalá, labor is the lifeblood of culture. I mean, even when we think about like in long history of humanity, that when we think about when we stopped being nomads and settled down, it was agriculture that really led to civilization, and it really was that labor. So I think that they both, in some ways, I mean, their styles are different, lots of different about their works, but there is a shared spirit or impetus of of how important labor is and how it gives rise to culture.
That's exactly right. Thank you. And the word that gets used in the 1930s art context is proletarian, and while this is too avant-garde and too disjunctive to be traditional proletarian writing, it has that spirit, it has that muscularity, forgive the word, right?
Sure.
So that's the spirit in which I read it and loved it so much.
Yes.
So let's talk about land art in Silk City. What's those pronouns are all over the place. It's very disjunctive, right? We have a they, we have a we have a she, switches to a he. Is that important?
It is. I also think that the ambiguity or the slippages are important too. I mean, I think I'd written elsewhere that it often feels, this book in particular, it often feels like the book is stone sober in its faithful representation of issues you can't quite put your finger on. In other words, so by that I mean that by signaling documentary and by signaling that sort of like reportage of everyday life, or kind of giving voice to, maybe the subaltern or the dispossessed. There's a very sober regard of those scenes, but there's a lot of fuzziness and a lack of clarity, and I do think that maybe a high reliance on pronouns that may be kind of indistinct is definitely a part of it. Another is double entendre. I mean, first of all, I mean, like land art could be, has possibilities.
Tell me some of the possibilities.
We'll say so. The title is Land Art in the Silk City. We know so. Silk City is a nickname for Patterson because of the industries that it had, the work that it had produced. But land art, whether it's if it's playing on the a kind of something different from the reliance on the Passaic River for energy to produce this stuff. We're not talking about the water, we're talking about the land, but also, do we land, like land as in a landing, right?
Land art, yes, okay, got it.
There's always something to be seen. I mean, even from the very beginning, they filmed. I mean, film has a kind of like double entendres. Is it a veneer? Is it slick, or is it filmed as in video? Right? They filmed.
Really
they filmed. So did they cover it with a surface, or did they videotape it? Right. They filmed the paint factory from the second story. Yes. Right. And isn't that what documentaries are? There's there's the world of the surface, and then we're going to reveal something. Right. The second story.
Right.
They filmed the paint factory from the second story of our house. All those cameras looking out from us. But there are other ones, like evening news. Right. is it the evening news that's because it's at 7 p.m.? Or is it evening because we're going to level the playing field, right? Or are we going to even things out, right?
Yeah.
The evening news, and then buildings, letter against letter, down the line, right? Or what's brewing next door, or to look for another guide, right? There's lots of, implications of how you can take these things and the suggestiveness, the kind of like the quantum aspect of like there being like possibilities that are layered on top of each other.
And then you can do the simple what happened here kind of reading, which is what I did at first. I had this sense that there's a family that lives in the factory neighborhood, and there was a fire, and the eyewitness news crew said we'd like to film from here, and therefore they were in this family was in the evening news. That it's another murder fire kind of typical Patterson 11 o'clock show, right? You can read it that way.
Yeah. And what you were saying about how certain ambiguities of there being the multiple use of pronouns and being not so specific, I actually kind of looked up to see what were there big explosions
and?
that in 77. The New York Times covered one in 1985, and I wonder if that may be that might have been something that might have been a motivation for the poem, or at least a part of the memory that Alcalá was using when she wrote about it. So
do you know Alcalá's work, so you probably have a sense of where, pardon the phrasing, where she is. What's the sensibility, what's the tone that she brings to this, either poem by poem or across the books. Where is she in this? What is there a point of view that we can say is authorial in here?
Well, I think that she's actually, I think in some ways one way that I can read this is that she's grounding herself not in the documentarian's perspective or in that identity, but in the subject's identity. Because if I'm going to take, we were the evening, they filmed the paint factory from the second story of our house. All those cameras looking out from us.
Right.
If I take that right away as being like these are residents in a tenement building.
That's right.
And usually the perspective of the news that we watch on TV is something authoritarian, it's institutional, it's something, broadcast to us. But this time, we're the eyes.
Yeah.
And they're coming in to inhabit us, not the other way around.
Subjects, finally.
Right. Yeah, and now we're...
Are you saying that might be the subject position of this work, of this book, of this poet?
There's a plausible reading of that. That's what I think.
If you're saying that,
yeah.
I think you're great.
Thanks.
No, but I think that's that's so great.
I think that's part of it.
That's what these poems are trying to do.
I think so. I think it's more of a, I think that one way of reading it and reading it, under the kind of direction of understanding it as, undocumentary, which I love. It's
we should talk about that.
Yeah, because
book
also
is called Undocumentaries.
Yes,
which suggests a bunch of things. Let's rattle them off. One, what does it suggest?
Documentaries, undocumented,
right? As in immigrants,
right? As in she is the daughter of immigrants,
right?
And
is there a third?
And then also just the document of actually of writing something, of a text.
Right.
But these are texts and maybe non-texts.
Yeah. So let's go back over them. So one is the documentary, as in the film crew, or really these poems. This is Patterson today. This is my Patterson. Okay. Two, the question of immigrants and the so-called undocumented.
Yeah.
Which, when you read it literally, means, we don't write about you. History doesn't include you because you're not documented. It becomes kind of a pun.
Yeah. You don't have a speaking role.
You don't have a speaking role
in whatever drama of public discourse.
And third is, the accumulation of materials that testify, documents. Okay. Great title for a book.
Absolutely.
And how you use the word documented, documentary. I don't think you said undocumented in the context of this prose poem, which otherwise doesn't use that word. So now apply the title, please, the title of the book to this piece.
Well, I think that in applying the title to the poem, I think that there's one aspect of it which is the documentarian. I mean, she uses certain, some of the words actually, filmed and cameras looking out from us in the evening news. So she does have, there is a certain aspect of, of reporters who are covering.
There are
this.
actually reporters in the
they're
story.
actually there. It's interesting but the document aspect of it being, of a text, right? One thing that I really love about this poem and the other poem that you paired with it, they're both prose poems, which has a hyphen in it, or is a hybrid. Just by using the term prose poem, we don't have a neater term for that. We're saying it's a poem, but it doesn't look like one, right? So or at least it's syntactically
Are you
coherent.
saying that the very choice of that hybrid form is part of the undocumented spirit, or the spirit of reversing the undocumented?
I think it's kind of like being somewhere in between, like authority and dispossessed, or the one who's doing the talking and the one who's being talked about, right? That kind of interstitial relationship that I think that, in lots of subtle ways, I think that she buttresses that sort of idea aesthetically as well as in content.
How about art? So, land art in the Silk City, and then I'm about to read the last two sentences, or really the last sentence. But in this concept, the titular concept of the undocumented, or undocumentaries, or documents, those three senses, how does art work? He thought it best, we don't know who he is at that point, he thought it best to send away for another guide, what art, and it's a question that doesn't end in a question mark, so it might not be a question. What art would power him to turn the river back to silk and make the world watch it burn? What is being asked there, and what art are we talking about? I've asked you a very difficult question.
It is challenging because she does leave these pockets of like certainty out. He thought it best to send away for another guide.
We have no idea what that means. Right?
I don't.
Comes from nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to brainstorm possibilities, I mean, part of it maybe he, as documentarians or like news broadcasters tend to do, they film the event and then they talk to locals with a microphone. Right. I don't know if maybe her family, like a guide.
Like a person to guide them. Oh, yes, of course.
Maybe
so
they want to,
someone who will speak the local language, because English is by no means the only language being spoken by the people of Patterson.
It could be that. It could be a kind of a linguistic, kind of disjuncture, or it could also be maybe they're just not very good at saying the things that they want to hear. Or maybe they're not really giving a good interview. You know what I mean? Right. I don't know. It could be something completely else, but I feel like that's possibly
Let's
there.
Go with that.
Maybe like knock on the next door neighbor's door and see if they can give me a better 8-second soundbite. I don't know.
And now the question of what art. First of all, what would art have to do with transforming the Passaic River back to the thing that the factories made and presumably don't make anymore?
Well, along the readings of what I suggested from this, of my reading of Guide, maybe, maybe someone who could describe it better or say it better or have something better to say about the fire burning outside that we're filming for the 5 o'clock news. That's one possibility. What art would power him to turn the river back to silk and make the world watch it burn? Because after all, they want to get people to watch this on the news. If I'm the reporter
Fires
covering
and murders.
it, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's better? What would go viral more than a factory exploding like fireworks, right? So, what art would power him to turn the river back to silk, as opposed to this mundane thing that it is that's just there, and also to make people compelled to watch this event, right?
I see some magic in there. I see the power, the magic of art, almost alchemical, and I don't know. The idea that the whole world is watching is, of course, a revolutionary phrase.
Yeah, it is.
It's specific to the 60s, not the 30s, right? And it seems to me that it is almost a meta-poetic or meta-aesthetic moment, the only one in this poem, where the speaker of this poem is trying to explore how the Passaic River, the generator of all that power, so there's the power, in the past could actually become kind of magically the thing that we made. And that would be the thing people would want to know about Patterson.
It also recovers something, some of the, I mean, when people think of Patterson in the world, like, being the producer of silk seems like such a exotic, thing to be known for. Right. Although, factories and warehouses along the Passaic River are not terribly exotic, right? No. It's, there's a sort of I think there's a curiosity as to, like, wow, can we maybe recover that aspect of thinking about this place?
Well, when you think about producing silk, you think about the gritty, the proletarian lives in the gritty factory, which basically dumped shit into the river and produced this gorgeous art, this smooth thing that, only animals could make in the old days.
It's spools of royalty, right? Exactly. I mean, that's like, as opposed to...
almost, forgive the word, almost oriental.
Yeah.
About bringing silk back to this factory town.
I mean, it's not exactly the same thing as, producing hammers or something like that, I mean, it's known for this unbelievably beautiful thing. And that, when you mention that all the stuff that gets dumped into the river, I feel like that's another double entendre of make the world watch it burn, because in some ways, there are probably little eddies on the Passaic where you can light a match and throw it on it and it might sort of burn.
Famously, that was Cleveland in the 1960s or 70s, and of course it would be true of Patterson. Let's turn from the land art to this food processing. So job number 2. One gets the sense that the speaker, the subject position who is producing this book, we can say Rosa, or we can just say the speaker, the subject, has had a bunch of jobs, and food processing is one of them. So this is this poem that's very witty and smart, and almost smart-alecky.
Yes.
Dangerously close to the electric heater. Okay, one imagines a kind of slapdash cold factory where they're just taking risks with the workers' lives, possibly producing a fire. Dangerously close to the electric heater, we could be dorm room lovers, whispering, we, I guess 2 workers, friends who were nearby, whispering of revolutions in vacuum-packed foods. Now, revolution is a double entendre because it's partly revolution as in political radicalism, but partly revolutions in the bullshit selling phrases of revolution in vacuum-packed foods, right? So
maybe even a third would be revolving, but revolution about...
Yeah. So, and then she looks out the window, which is a common thing that people do in this book, to where the woods meet the road, and think not everyone knows how peas get in a can. What is she contemplating? Looking out at some more natural scene beyond the factory, and wondering, I live in a world in which everybody knows how to get peas in a can, but not everybody does.
Yeah. Well, they're also, I mean, if, canned peas are ubiquitous, but, like, you ever thought about, like, how that happens? I think that gets back to the title of the whole book, of, again, of, like, the revealing things that people may not know about. That's also kind of couched in a desire to pursue some justice. Right. I mean, one thing that I love about this is that again, with double entendre, she's using certain terminology from pipe fitting and plumbing that defamiliarized out of the context feel like they're like portmanteaus or, like butt weld fittings, right? Like, what do butt weld fittings do? They either redirect or resize the path of what's flowing through a pipe. So it would be like an elbow joint, or it would be something that would turn, 3.5 inches into 2 inches. But that's what butt weld fittings are.
I didn't know that.
And likewise, feminine parts, like, screws have, a masculine and feminine, so do electrical plugs. So she's bringing out some of these, this terminology, really mundane terminology that I think that any plumber or, or pipe fitter, which wouldn't strike them as like having a poetry to it, right? But she's taking them out of context and producing this kind of almost a gendered tension, a tension between a he and a she, right? Secretary to the sanitary piping impresario. Right away, she's being, as you said, smart alecky.
It's pretty funny.
It is pretty funny. I mean, it's irony and satire,
so is the word
adventures. Yeah, exactly. Adventures in food processing, right? Yeah, like adventures in selling insurance or something.
Exactly.
It's not terribly adventurous, but his rubber leg, my nude hose, right? Legs are in pipe fitting, like a leg would be something that would be a sort of kind of a piece that would collect sediment or dripping so that it doesn't clog a pipe. And likewise, a nude hose would be something that is not coated with a second substance.
Yeah.
And and so that she's taking these terms that a plumber or a pipe fitter would use all the time, but by, putting his rubber leg, my nude hose, selling butt weld fittings, already has like a kind of a sexual tension to it for someone who knows nothing about pipe fitting or these kinds of industrial, concerns. Feminine parts for the ubiquitous crew. Even then, the only lady in the room and with the dirtiest joke. So she's building that.
And presumably that is the secretary, the one woman in this in this very male situation, right?
Right. Because then, if it is his secretary, then also, of course, nude hose has a different meaning, pantyhose, that
right.
Or sheer. So,
right.
And so there's a
and then there's the imagination that they are like dorm room lovers. So there's two of them. It seems secretary and the guy, the man.
Right.
So there's a lot of tension. But where does this ignorance come from? In the middle of this possibly power disproportionate situation, maybe a situation of some duress, this person needs this job, and this is in the middle of this, that's when she looks out the window to the woods to see what might be beyond this life, and then thinks, oh, I live in a world in which everybody knows how to get peas in a can, but there is a world in which people don't know that. And it ends with the word ignorance. You wonder whether ignorance is a positive or negative valence there. Wouldn't it be great to be ignorant about how you process food?
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I flew out to Seattle, because I've read that the last thing you want to order on a plane is the coffee. I don't recall exactly why, but it's probably not like, the freshest or the healthiest for you. And, it's one of those things that better not ask, just, get a ginger ale instead.
That kind of ignorance.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
But to me, again, I feel like, if we were to look at this as on the scale of what a sonnet does when there's a turn after an octet, right? And when we get to the point and around on that ratio, I look out the window to where the woods meet the road is really where that happens, where there's a sort of kind of like bringing in the big question, or
it does that. And you're saying that makes me think of something bringing us to a slightly different topic, which is, I think these prose poems strike me sometimes as little microfictions. Well, not little ones, microfictions. Yeah. They're all little. And if I were to, Xerox a few of these and stick them next to the most avant-garde of Lydia Davis's microfictions or others, someone could read them as short stories. Which really starts to sound like the documentation of the life. The little stories of the people. Like modernism begins with fictions like Winesburg, Ohio, of different voices of regular folks. Certainly this is what the broad-shouldered proletarians of Chicago were trying to do. And I think of the word guide. I mean, I misread it. I think your reading is best, but I misread it as in order to understand Patterson, you have to order the WPA guide, the famous guide. Like if you want to understand it, the workers of the 30s wrote it up. That was documentation, and it was the documentary impulse. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is, I'm going to throw it back to you. Could we read this book as a series of little stories, little splinters from lives, from worker lives?
I think so. Tiny little flash fictions. I think so. And I think what makes them work is, as you had mentioned before, about her reliance on lots of pronouns, sort of like not being, real precise about who she's identifying, who's talking here. Right. I think that it works in that way of you thinking about them as sort of like mini flash fictions, because of how imprecise and nondescript she is of who's the cast of this play. Right. So I think that, and in some ways they may only really work as little flash fictions because of that, because people can project, they can fill in those gaps. Right. And what she's really putting in is just sort of like suggestions of a drama or some sort of narrative. But it's really just like of the slightest bit of suggestion. Right. It's very impressionistic. A little stroke makes a cape, right? That sort of thing. Right. She does that quite a bit.
What I'd like to do is have each of us point out a word, phrase, or sentence from each one and just talk about it. So it sort of forces us to do some close reading because this work rewards it. So do you have one in the land arc that we haven't talked about that you'd like to put into the record?
Yes.
Which one?
It is the second to last sentence. What becomes visible in calamity quickly burns to nothing.
Okay, translate that. That's a great line. Can you paraphrase?
Yeah. What becomes visible in calamity quickly burns to nothing. Again, I think in her truncating her expression here, it amplifies the possibilities, and I do think that there are probably multiple simultaneously that are viable. What becomes visible in calamity quickly burns to nothing. Maybe, as we had mentioned before, a little bit about, working classes, underclasses, people whose identities or voices don't have suitable expression or regard in public discourse, right? And they only enter that discussion or attention when something really bad happens that's going to catch the eye or attention of a public, right? So what becomes visible in calamity, in other words, the plight of maybe a working class, say, quickly burns to nothing. So for as long as there's a fire outside that's going to destroy property and is going to get people to switch over to Channel 4, right? We get to pay attention to this working class neighborhood. When that's over, then we go back to acting like they don't, and we go back to not knowing how canned peas get made, right?
Right. Oh, gosh.
You know what I mean?
Oh, you just said something really important. Can you say that again in different words? You're paralleling two kinds of ignorance.
Yeah. One is an ignorance of existing on a level of privilege that, there is no motivation or repercussion, no motivation for you to really fully understand it, nor a repercussion for you to not understand it, right? So what becomes visible in calamity quickly burns to nothing. I think that's one reading, but I think, again, with her being as, nuanced and sort of sidestepping like certainty, like she allows people to be able to read into it. Yeah. In useful ways.
Let me do my sentence from this one, and then we'll go to one sentence from you for the second one. It's the sentence before the one you quoted. And how no one knows, another lack of knowledge thing, how no one knows what's brewing next door until one barrel after another shoots 50 feet into the air and stars the night. Well, that's a really open-ended description of something. The "and" refers partly to what else the news might cover. Follows way back up where there's a boy up the street dabbling in mesmerism. I have no idea what that means, but it's possible that the news might cover that. But how no one knows what's brewing next door. In other words, we do not enter these people's lives. They don't enter my apartment unless there's a fire, and you can film it from this perspective. Otherwise, they have no relationship to the importance of our apartment. And then something's going on. There's some domestic dispute, and there is either a shooting, or it might be fireworks or something. Could be metaphorical fireworks going on next door. But I like that idea that once again, what are the conditions that must obtain before anyone who doesn't find the urgency in documenting this life, those outside it, watchers of the 11 o'clock news who would never set foot in the neighborhood being covered by shootings and fires. This is the way we get on.
Yeah.
All right, sentence from the second one for you, one that you liked, or a phrase?
Okay. I would say, even then, the only lady in the room, and with the dirtiest joke. I think it's so, I mean, even then...
Even then is a great
Even
phrase.
then.
Even then. Notwithstanding.
Right. Or, again, it was like, usually idiomatically when we say, even then, we're kind of changing direction, right? Like, even can also mean something else, right?
Yeah.
Even then, right? Like, we're even, right?
Yeah.
Even then. But the only lady in the room, and to use lady, right, as, in this situation, I feel like it kind of like insinuates propriety, or it insinuates something else. And with the dirtiest joke, which kind of counteracts that in parentheses. I feel like I still don't feel totally confident as to how it works in every way. But I do think it sets a tone, and I do think that it in some ways it grounds, the way in which we ought to take it. If there is some semblance of a scene here. Again, we don't really, it's not so sure. But I think that one, I mean, it's equally, I think it sets the tone, but it also is equally, as confounding as any other line that she would write in a prose poem. Even then, the only lady in the room, and with the dirtiest joke. It's like
a fragment, too.
She just keeps changing directions. I mean, every 2 or 3 words, sometimes she can just kind of completely change the direction, and that's what I mean by like syntactically. Her lines are accessible and understandable in English, but at the same time, there's a sort of like it sounds like you're really trying to tell us something really important, but like I don't know what it is. Yeah. I know what it might be about. I know what it might be related to. I may know what its rhetorical stance might be. But what is the it there? I don't know.
The solution to ignorance on the part of privileged readers or recipients of the land art who don't know this life, the solution to ignorance is not to tell them in documentary style that will do all the work for them so that comprehension is easy. The thing to do is to work in art, to write poems like this, where you have to do the work if you want to understand. And documentary is not signed, sealed, delivered, easy peasy. Yeah. It's hard. It's got to be hard. And she makes it hard.
Yes, she does.
All right, my final one is one that we already talked about, but I'm going to repeat it. I look out the window to where woods meet the road. Now, it seems to me that when I think about William Carlos Williams Patterson, I don't think so much about the gritty Patterson. I grew up in New Jersey, so I know Patterson pretty well. The gritty Patterson that I almost think is, once he's written about it a lot, I'm not surprised by it that often.
Right.
What surprises me is when he breaks away, when he goes down to the river, for instance, or whether he drives out into the meadowlands and realizes that the woods meet the road, that there is what passes for nature in northern New Jersey. And that it becomes lyrical and beautiful, and the time-honored tradition of the poet who looks out the window Coleridge, Keats, they're always looking out windows.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and
that's what's happening here.
I think so too. And there's also, it was a few years ago, I think it was, I forget who was the scholar, but who's someone who had discovered this sort, was it Thaddeus? I forget the man's name, but the man who lived in Patterson, he was an African-American man who lived in Patterson and actually had chicken coops and a red wheelbarrow in his yard. I remember that. Yeah, this was
possibly
some years back.
Just a few years ago.
Thaddeus
possibly
Smith, I believe
the
his name
source
was.
of the wheelbarrow.
Right.
Chickens in wheelbarrow.
Right. Which makes you, or just
I know
like
where
saying,
you're going with this.
Yeah, or just like saying zinc oxidized roofs and things like that. That in Williams's work, even on even in the Red Wheelbarrow or some of his really tiny imagist poems, as well as something on the scale of Patterson, that there is a documentarian aspect. There is sometimes, if you dig enough, you'll see that there was a reality, a truth, a history that was a motivation that he filtered a few times into his poetry. And I think that that's happening here as well.
I do think so too. And the reason why I'm excited that you brought it up now is that guy Thaddeus, we're stipulating that's his name, but anyway, that guy lived in Patterson at a time when the urban situation was also quite rural, where you had chickens and wheelbarrows in your backyard.
Yeah.
Right? And so, one of the great things that that poem suggests, and that these poems suggest, is that so much depends upon observation of what's really there. And if you're writing about Patterson and there's woods along the road, then that's real.
Yeah.
Don't play into the assumption that everybody has that everything is gritty and industrial.
Exactly. And it also makes you wonder how that would, why that would pique Williams's interest to write that key poem. I mean, his mother, is Puerto Rican, and his father, grew up there. His British father grew up there. My parents are Puerto Rican, and they live there too. And so there are still chicken coops and red wheelbarrows in people's backyards now. So
so much depends upon that.
And how much it picks up on his mind. Why that's a detail that he would write about.
Their origins.
Right.
She's got a long... The speaker of the second poem, Adventures in Food Processing Job Number 2, has a longing for a world in which some people don't know how to put peas in a can. In fact, they probably grow the peas, and there's no cans,
But I do want to, before we end, make sure that we say, I do think that, Rosa's experience, as she has these lists of job 1, job 2, job 3, and 4, here I do feel like there is a particular experience of her, an experience of having a job as a woman, secretary to this, the sanitary piping impresario, where she is the, amanuensis or assistant, and he is the impresario, as in he's like a patron, the De Medici of pipe fitting, but there's that kind of showing that kind of power dynamic, but then the double entendre of butt weld, the double entendre of my nude hose, the kind of dangerously close to the electric heater. Is it dangerous because it's going to start a fire, or is it dangerous because you're getting pushed into a corner, right? And to look out the window, and then also to look at the lamentable suckback of such ignorance. I mean, it's just so loaded with suggestion. Meaning, I don't know if it's loaded with meaning. I think it's loaded with suggestion of pathways that you can read.
Yeah. If the little metapoetic moment or the recognition that this is an art form and an artwork in the first one, Land Art in the Silk City, is what art would power him, the art it will require to take the Passaic and imagine silk, then if that's there, then the metapoetic moment in the second poem is the fact that she is a secretary. She is recording, documenting, taking notes, and basically we get to see it only because the secretary gives it to us,
Right.
Final thought on this book, on these choices of poems, something you wanted to say that you haven't had a chance to yet.
I think all of Rosa Alcalás poems, as well as her, this collection too, deceptively small, They're deceptively tiny, I think, and she has a talent for the tinier she makes it, the more she amplifies possibilities of meaning. And I do think that she is her bio of herself on her website, she has said, I've not met her in person, and but I do know that she has said that she is the daughter of Spanish immigrants. And I do think that she is I think she's very concerned and very attuned. She's expert in finding those spaces in between things, in between experiences, in between perspectives, and handling it with such, and just being able to not just really kind of fill them in, but like open up more possibilities. I really enjoy reading her work.
Thank you so much, David. This was great.
Thank you.